You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with former Conservative Special Advisor Anita Boateng and the editor for The Voice newspaper, Lester Holloway. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. And they are, of course, dominated by the Russell Brand story. The Sunday Times headline is accused Russell Brand, the sex predator who hid in plain sight. He denies allegations made against him and says past relationships were all consensual. The Mirror also leads on the Russell Brand story. The Sunday Telegraph leads with the allegations against Russell Brand also. It has the headline that the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss, is to criticise Rishi Sunak's £35 billion of overspending since he became Prime Minister. The Express headline says that millions of people are ditching the NHS and opting instead to go private for their healthcare. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by former Conservative Special Advisor Anita Boateng and the editor for The Voice newspaper, Lester Holloway. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the Sunday Telegraph. The Sunday Express. We're going to start with the front page there. And that is the story that millions are ditching the crisis-hit NHS and deciding to go private. Take us into this story, Anita.
Yes, so the Express has hired a consultancy group to do some research into kind of use of private healthcare. It obviously reflects the fact that there are now 7.68 million people on the NHS waiting list as of July 2023. And they've done some analysis saying that there's been a 44% rise in people using private healthcare. And they've gone through, and they've got a story from Vicky, who has decided to go for private healthcare when she had an injury, and it just talks about some of the expectations of that rising. So this really goes to the heart of some of the questions that both political parties will be grappling with during the general election, because the NHS feels like real battleground, whether it's because of strikes or because of the challenges around Rishi Sunak putting £200 million of extra funding in for this winter. Everyone is still braced for it to be quite a rocky period for the NHS.
And Lester, it's not an easy choice for people to make. I mean, the subheading there, patients forced to spend life savings to avoid a record wait for treatment. So it's something that people are feeling forced into.
Absolutely, and people are spending their life savings on all sorts of things, whether it actually be, care for them when they're older, or sometimes actually just dipping into their life savings as part of the cost of living crisis. But I think that a key question that really emerges from the Sunday Express story is about those that actually can afford private healthcare in the first place as an option, because many people can't. Now, obviously, we don't want people to dip into their life savings, erode it, because, that will have a huge impact on their quality of life as they get older. But at the same time, this story really speaks to a two-tier system where those that can afford it are going private simply because the NHS is in such dire straits. We had a story yesterday about older people, the elderly actually waiting 14 to 16 hours to actually get a bed. And so with this crisis, clearly people don't want to wait that length of time and are going private, which is completely unacceptable. The other side of the the issue about private healthcare is that the government, the NHS, are actually commissioning more from private hospitals anyway. So you've got two situations going on. The first one is that people, as this story says, are actually spending their money on private healthcare, and the second is that the government is actually having to rely, to a certain extent, on private healthcare to take up some of the slack, because the NHS simply can't cope after so many years of austerity.
And inside the paper, they're actually projecting that the crisis will lead to what they're describing as a two-tier health service.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a fairly dramatic headline, right? Because I think that there have been many times in history, and actually the Labour government also did it in 1997, where governments have turned to the the private sector in order to kind of build in some more capacity. And obviously, we know that more people, turning private will hopefully reduce the waiting lists as well. I don't think that's the government strategy, but inevitably, all the work it's doing around getting pharmacies to prescribe, for instance, is all about building in some more of this capacity. Now, we know we are an ageing society. We know that fundamentally, the projections around our health have changed dramatically, certainly over the last decade. And so I think that it tends to be quite simplistic to make it about austerity instead of about the structural ways in which our healthcare needs have changed quite a lot. And, our taxation is high as a result to kind of keep up with that increasing demand.
The trouble is that spending on healthcare was actually reduced over recent years as a proportion of GDP. And I think that's actually showing in the service that we see and we experience.
But it is, you're saying that it's not, the focus of the argument shouldn't be about austerity, but it's people that are forced to, as we were saying, use their life savings. It's not an option that they're taking willy-nilly. It's because they're in dire need and they need treatment now.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that the demands on the NHS, if we look at post-COVID, we're looking at 3 million more people, in need. There are absolutely ways in which the NHS, absolutely is struggling, and doctors and nurses are working tremendously hard. But as we grow into an ageing population, as demands on the health service increase and treatments become more expensive, it becomes more and more difficult, even if you maintain or continue to give record-breaking increases in the amount of spending, that you still hit on this challenge around capacity and meeting the emerging needs of the population.
Let's take a look at this story in the Sunday Telegraph, and it's about Liz Truss. She's going to be criticising Rishi Sunak's £35 billion of overspending since becoming Prime Minister. This is in a speech at the Institute for Government due to take place tomorrow, and almost 1 year on from her ill-fated mini-budget. She's handing out advice. What do you think to that?
Well, yes, she's clearly got a finger on the pulse there with the NHS crumbling and schools crumbling around young people. She's actually saying that criticising Rishi Sunak for spending too much money on these services. So I don't think that's necessarily going to chime with many people. But I think it's also part of Liz Truss's rejuvenation. We're seeing a lot of support for her from the right. It almost feels like she's actually being rehabilitated, to be perfectly honest. I don't know, how this is going to go down, but I think that a lot of people will be highly sceptical of it. They haven't forgotten the budget which crashed the economy and put, people's interest, the interest rates up, which has actually affected people's mortgages. So, she continues to try and I guess kickstart her career.
And Anita, she's going to be claiming that spending would have been £35.5 billion lower over 2 years if her plans had been carried through. So still insisting that she didn't do anything wrong and her budget could have worked.
Well, there's something curious in this piece, because she definitely talks about how she would have, held the line and effectively would not have allowed a spending review to bring more money into certain particular departments. But she sort of says, well, I would have taken a sort of tough approach. But, she never has to prove that hypothetical, right? She wasn't in government long enough. And when we look at the reasons why the spending review had to be revised, I think it would be very hard to see how Truss would have been able to resist some of those demands. And it's striking here that in the Telegraph story, it talks about how she was prevented from stopping benefits from increasing along one of the higher rates of inflation by Tories, including Penny Mordaunt, breaking ranks to oppose the idea. It's like, well, you still would have been Prime Minister and you still could have done it, but you didn't in that instance. And yet you're sort of saying, well, I would have, in this hypothetical situation, when met with spending review demands, have resisted them. The final thing I would say, though, is it doesn't seem as though she's sort of actually criticising Rishi Sunak in the piece. It's sort of a, well, I would have held the line, which is slightly more about her saying I'm tough, rather than, it feels like to me, sort of taking the fight to Rishi Sunak.
OK, but it says she will suggest Mr Sunak was wrong to grant extra money to public services last autumn.
Well,
Lester?
From what I can read, it doesn't seem like she's quite being that emphatic.
I think what this is really about is the argument between a state where we're investing in public services and a small state. And, we have these ideologues that actually want to shrink the state and to have the private sector take a greater role. And I think that she's the embodiment of that philosophy.
I mean,
you wanted to come back there.
She didn't make any proposals that I can think of that involved more of a role for the private sector.
We know she's a champion for this line of thinking.
Well, she was a Prime Minister for 50 days and didn't do anything of that, and there was nothing of that in her plan for growth, so, yeah.
OK. Anita and Lester, thank you very much for the minute. We are going to take a break coming up. This in the Sunday Telegraph. It claims that not a single suspect has been prosecuted in the UK for spying for China. Stay with us for more on that and other stories. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, former Conservative Special Advisor Anita Boateng and the editor for The Voice newspaper, Lester Holloway. Right, in this section, we're going to kick off with the front page of The Telegraph. And this story, the headline, UK fails to prosecute Chinese spy suspects. Anita, fill us in on the detail, the background bit to this story.
Yes, I mean, there's been so much attention on China in recent weeks because of the revelations about a researcher in Parliament sort of reportedly being arrested back in March over some spying allegations. And so the Telegraph has followed up by looking at sort of a series of cases. It says that not a single suspect has been prosecuted over compared to almost 150 in the US. And it cites the fact that there was a revelation from MI5 a few years ago saying that the amount of activity that MI5 were undertaking on China had increased dramatically. So effectively, the Telegraph is saying sort of why isn't there action being taken? Now, one of the interesting parts here is it mentions the Official Secrets Act. And apparently the Official Secrets Act, which dates back to 1911, maybe around then, that's incredibly outdated and is one of the factors in why it's sort of not fit for purpose in terms of allowing these prosecutions.
Lester, the men who both deny the accusations, they were arrested in March but bailed until next month. Unlikely that they'll be charged under the Official Secrets Act.
Well, they might be. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But I think that this story kind of really lands on the back of criticism of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary taking trips to China. And what's really underlining this story really I think is the suspicion that Britain is somehow soft on China because it's not prosecuting Chinese spies. Now, we don't know how many Chinese spies there are, but clearly every major nation spies on every other. And so I think people will be rightly asking the question, why is Britain not finding and prosecuting Chinese spies, especially in the light of the parliamentary story about the parliamentary researcher that is alleged to have been spying for China.
And there has been some criticism that the government is opening up to China. The visit, James Cleverly, to China has been criticised, and that really isn't the path that we perhaps should be taking.
Well, the interesting thing about the Conservatives' approach to China has been this narrative that, it's changed dramatically. There was sort of the golden era of George Osborne and David Cameron, and then suddenly it was sort of put on ice, and then you had the tough rhetoric from Liz Truss as Foreign Secretary and then as Prime Minister. But actually, if you kind of look beyond the language, the behaviour has been broadly consistent, which is to raise a lot of criticisms in private, to do some commercial deals, but also to be pretty, close to the US and other members of the Five Eyes, the other sort of aligned intelligence countries, in being pretty tough on Beijing at times. And I think that what we've seen from, for instance, the decision to allow Hong Kong and people to come over to the UK, there have been some quite testy moments. And it was clear from James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary's trip, that he's definitely, allowing himself to be both pragmatic but also pretty punchy on some core issues like human rights. But there is a balance that I can't actually see there's much difference between how a Labour administration under David Lammy and also James Cleverly are really playing the China question.
OK, we're going to do a bit of a gear change and take viewers to the Daily Star. Lester, this story, the end is nigh.
Yes, the end is nigh. What the Daily Star on Sunday are alleging is that young people are staying at home, not going to work because they're afraid of the end of the world. I'm not quite sure exactly what evidence this story relies on, and certainly the graphic designer has gone to town. I think had a bit of a mare there. I mean, at the end of the day, what the statistics show is that there has been a slight uptick, certainly in the last year or two, in terms of sick leave. I don't know what the breakdown is according to age group, but over a longer period of time, over 10, 15 years, it's actually been broadly stable. So there isn't a crisis of people generally, workers generally, taking more time off than they have before, but maybe it's the slight uptick which is sparked the Daily Star to suggest that
it's not the sort of excuse you think many people will use. I can't come into work because the
well, I assume it relates to the environmental crisis, but I don't know what evidence there is really to back this particular headline up. Probably not very much.
Lester and Anita, thank you very much for the moment. We're going to check on the weather now.